I feel like one of the themes recently for the NBA is like incredibly unprecedented situations, right? Like guys requesting trades with multiple years left on their contracts, all these teams giving away all these future first round picks in exchange for stars, the possibility of the one and done rule being eliminated in a double draft that's never happened before. And going along with that theming, it feels really unprecedented whatever's going to happen with Brooklyn this upcoming season. With the exception of like the Kobe Bryant trade request that then ended up getting walked back when he was with the Lakers, there's really no parallel to what Brooklyn went through this offseason and then what they're going to go into this year, where one of the best players in the league requests a trade and then is unable to be traded and just comes back to the group and everybody's supposed to just be really excited about it. And that context to me has so much to unpack, and I really, really want to talk about what Brooklyn could be walking into this upcoming season. Now, we have to begin the conversation with Kevin Durant, right? And there's a really important thing to keep in mind here with KD. He's one of the most unique personalities that we have in the league, and it's very possible that he's just like, I want it out, now I don't anymore, let's just go play basketball. Like, he's one of the very few guys I feel like in the league that is just all he wants to do is play basketball. It's the only thing he wants to do. He wants to put himself in a position to win. He wants to play basketball, and that's it. And so I think there's a real possibility he just comes back to the team and everybody's like, hey, yeah, maybe my feelings are a little bit hurt that he wanted to be away from this organization, but we have Kevin Durant in our basketball team. Like, that's not something that I'm necessarily going to complain about. And yes, the situation was incredibly weird, and there's a real possibility that there's no way they're able to coalesce and figure all this out and build any kind of team chemistry, and Steve Nash gets fired partway through the year, and it's just a complete and utter disaster. When you combine what Kyrie has been as a personality, what KD has been as a personality, and then what Ben Simmons has done for the last 2 years, you combine all those three things together, that's obviously a recipe for potential disaster. However, indulge me for a second. Let's talk about this from a basketball perspective, just for a little bit for Brooklyn, because everything has been non-basketball related for Brooklyn for what feels like a year and a half. We have rumors about guys being unhappy and wanting to be traded, and James Harden not wanting to be there, and all the stuff that happened with Kyrie. Let's talk about basketball for a second. Okay. In theory, let's just think about this Nets roster. Okay. You have Kyrie, one of the better perimeter scorers in the league. You have KD, one of the better overall scorers in the league. You have Ben Simmons, who, when healthy, when we last saw him, was one of the best defenders in the league, and a guy that is an incredibly unique, some ways positively unique, some ways negatively unique player, especially when you combine him with perimeter scorers that can shoot where he doesn't need to have the basketball all the time. You have one of the better shooters in the league in Joe Harris, and you have an up-and-coming big in Nick Claxton, and that's your starting lineup. Like, that's the group that you can begin games with. And defensively, you have rim protection and perimeter defense in Simmons. Importantly, something different than last year, you have size on the perimeter. So KD isn't having to guard all these big time wing scorers. You have Ben Simmons for that. And of course, you have plenty of scoring. And when you just lay all those things out, it kind of feels like, wait, is Brooklyn actually going to be really good this year? I think it's easy to make that argument. And it's tough for me to put myself out there and say that because, of course, I'm a Nets fan. And anything that I say positively about Brooklyn right now, people are immediately going to look at me and say, well, you're only saying that because you're a Nets fan. Well, I really, really try to be objective about every team in the league, and specifically my team. I try and be overly objective and unbiased, honestly, about Brooklyn. And when I look at their situation, someone explain to me why this isn't going to work from a basketball perspective, right? You can talk about chemistry issues and all that, but if you just look at the basketball players that are on this team, if they're healthy, what are some of the reasons that it isn't going to work? Well, I'll tell you. Ben Simmons can be a huge, huge issue for this team, especially offensively, because there's a world in which Ben Simmons necessitates this team playing him as the only non-shooter on the floor. And once you start going into some of the depth pieces on this roster for Brooklyn, especially in terms of perimeter shooters, you don't really have any guys you can put on the floor that can shoot and can guard. And that's what you need around Simmons. If Simmons is going to be the non-shooter on the floor, then you need other scorers, Kyrie, KD, and then you also need wing guys that can guard and shoot. They have guys that can shoot, Patty Mills, Joe Harris. They have some guys that can guard a little bit, but they don't have both. And that was a huge issue for them last year. And if Simmons is supposed to be the guy that's going to be the defensive anchor, how exactly does that work when he's the only non-shooter on the floor and you don't have any other guys that are going to be out there and can guard? And that to me is by far the biggest question mark. I actually don't think that how is KD gonna integrate himself back into the team, and Kyrie, I actually don't think that's that big of a deal. I think those guys just want to play basketball, and if you start winning some games, I think everything's gonna be fine. The biggest question to me by far is what Simmons means to this team and how exactly they're gonna make that work with him. There's a positive spin on this where you can say that this is exactly what this guy needed. It's what a lot of people were saying at the time that they made the Harden trade, which they needed size, they needed a defender, they needed someone that they could give the basketball to and allow Kyrie and KD to work off the ball. And Simmons can be all those things. And they also needed more of a presence in transition. He can grab a rebound and go. And you've got Simmons running the floor. You've got KD and Kyrie on each side of him. You got Joe Harris in the corner. That's a devastating transition attack if you can get stops. But the possibility of like, we have to play either Nick Claxton or Ben Simmons for us to be a good offensive team. But if Simmons is the only good defender on the floor, we can't be a good defensive team. And obviously all that comes from the fact that the guy can't shoot. And that is such a unique challenge to try and deal with. And that's a challenge that we saw Philadelphia struggle to deal with for years. Now, having said that, if you think about Ben Simmons' time, we're going to talk about other guys in a second, but Simmons to me is really interesting. If you think about his time in Philadelphia, when did we see him be successful? When did we see him at his absolute best? Well, quite frankly, it was when Joel Embiid wasn't really a part of what they were doing. Joel Embiid's an incredible player, and he did everything he could to try and make the Simmons Embiid thing work, and Simmons did not. Embiid tried to become a better three-point shooter, and he did, and he was the spacer of the two, and he played outside of the paint more than he ever really wanted to. But in games in which Embiid didn't play, or when he was hurt down the stretch of the first couple of years where Philly was actually getting pretty good, and we saw Simmons in transition, we saw him with all this space and all these shooters and perimeter guys around him, he looked incredible. And that's a real possibility for this team, and I think that's a position where you can try and put Ben Simmons in a situation to be successful. The problem is that was happening when they had like true role players on that Sixers roster. KD and Kyrie are not role players, and I don't know how much they're going to be like, hey, Ben, run the offense. Ben, run in transition and create easy baskets for a guy that they never played with, a guy that created a very weird situation in the postseason last year when he said he was going to play and then he didn't, and it was just a strange situation. It's going to be really difficult for them to trust him, not to mention the fact that we have no idea if the guy's going to be healthy. He's had multiple back procedures. He hasn't played in a while. You really have no idea what you're going to get from him. And so to me, I think a lot of people are going to focus on the KD and the Kyrie thing, and is it going to be weird with KD returning to the team? That to me is not the biggest threat to this Nets season. The biggest threat to me of this Nets season is Ben Simmons being in and out of lineup due to injuries and never being able to figure out how exactly to make it work. I think there's a way to make it work with him and the rest of this roster, but the only way that they're going to be like a top 4 team in the East and a potential championship contender is if the Simmons thing works perfectly. And if it doesn't, and if he's in and out of lineup, and if he's hurt, it's just never ever going to work. And so I don't think that there's a team when you combine not just the Simmons stuff, but of course KD's age and Kyrie's injury issues, KD's injury issues, Ben Simmons' issues. When you combine all those things, I don't think there's a single team in the league that has such a big gap between like the worst case scenario version of them, where like if guys get hurt, guys are unhappy, KD could get traded at the trade deadline and this could be like a 25-30 win team, or at the top end of it, like if the Simmons fit is perfect and it's what people thought that it was going to be when they traded for him in the first place, and Kyrie and KD are playing really well and they're really focused and locked in. You've got all these shooters. Joe Harris is back. Steve Nash figures it out. This could be a 55 win team and a championship contending group and a team that you could see in the finals 9 months from now, whenever that is. I don't think there's a single other team in the league, even teams that I think are really volatile, like Philly with injury issues potentially of their own and aging guys and trying to figure out the rest of their roster. Phoenix, same thing. Like I think that there's a couple of really volatile teams, but there's not a single other team in the league that remotely comes close to matching the volatility of this Brooklyn team. And I think by far that is what makes them such an interesting team this year. And so ultimately, this is where I've landed for Brooklyn. I think that they're going to be a little bit better than most people anticipating. I think a lot of people are just kind of writing them off because of the drama, and I totally understand that. It's totally fair. But just in the way that I'm looking at it, I think they can easily be a top 4, top 5 team in the East and be a threat in the postseason. The thing that would make me feel better, maybe this is something they can fix during the season, is if they had a couple more legitimate like 6-7 guys that can guard and shoot, because traditionally we've always seen like that is what has helped you win postseason games. You need wings that can guard and shoot, and the Nets just have never had any of those guys from the time that KD and Kyrie got there. And Simmons is a great defender and someone that I think is really going to help them defensively, but we all know that he's not a floor spacer. And Joe Harris can really shoot the ball. Patty Mills can really shoot the ball. But when you get into postseason series and guys are hunting matchups and they're actively looking for players to attack, and you can't put a group of 4 guys on the floor that can actually guard, and then maybe you can try and hide the 5th guy, it gets really, really difficult. It's one of the reasons why Boston was so great in the postseason last year. There wasn't a guy to attack when they were healthy. They could switch everything, and there was not a good matchup, and that's become such a focal point of the way teams try and play offensively in the postseason, and you couldn't do that against Boston. That's still something you can do against Brooklyn every single night. During the regular season, it might not be that big of a deal. You say, Ben Simmons, go guard this guy, and hopefully everything's going to be fine. And maybe you can, put together a group where it's Simmons, KD, and Claxton, and you figure out the spacing in the offensive end of the floor, but the length and the versatility and the rim protection of those three guys is enough to put together like a top 12 defense in the league. I think that's at least a relative possibility, but that to me is something that would make me feel so much better, is if they had some other wings that you really felt like you could count on the postseason. And so ultimately, I think they're probably going to end up in a similar situation where they would have been last year if everybody was healthy, where KD is still incredible if he's healthy, Kyrie can still really score, but they just don't have enough two-way options and playoff caliber guys and depth on this roster to be a true, I really think they're going to make the finals team. I think they can easily get to the second round, maybe the conference finals, but right now it's really difficult to foresee a path for them to get to the finals. But I will tell you this, it's going to be no lack of interest. There's going to be no lack of interest around Brooklyn this season. If you want to watch a team potentially implode on any given night or score 140 on any given night, Brooklyn is the team to watch. It's going to be really fun. In a season in which there's so much intrigue with returning injury players and a league that I think in terms of just the top 20 teams in the league is probably about as talented as it's been in decades. The team that I think stands head and shoulders above the most interesting, the weirdest, the strangest team in the league is Brooklyn. There are other weird teams like Philadelphia, but Brooklyn is the team that I can't figure out, and it's the team that I'm going to change my mind on weekly throughout this season.